Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive. Now, for all you UPSC aspirants out there today, we're tackling a geopolitical scenario that's straight out of a mains exam question.
Oh, wow.
What if the U.S. decided to cozy up to Russia in order to counter China?
Okay.
It's like a wild strategy, right?
It does.
Well, this idea, which some are calling the reverse Nixon theory, is making waves in political circles.
Interesting.
We're going to break it all down for you, drawing from a really insightful Al Jazeera article that analyzes some of Trump's recent moves on the world stage.
It is a fascinating theory, and to understand it, we need to first look at what sparked this whole conversation.
Okay.
Trump has been making some surprisingly warm statements towards Putin, even as the conflict in Ukraine continues. It's raised a lot of eyebrows, especially considering his criticism of Zelensky for, in his words, not being grateful enough for U.S. support.
Right, and it's not just the rhetoric. The article highlights how Trump seems to be echoing some of Russia's talking points on the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
He's even suggested that Russia should be allowed back into the G7.
Oh, wow.
Which, as you can imagine, has caused quite a stir.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And this is where things get even more interesting. Trump has been very vocal about the economic opportunities he sees in a potential U.S.-Russia rapprochement.
Okay.
He's dangling the possibility of historic economic partnerships and incredible opportunities for U.S. companies in Russia if the war ends.
So could this be the real motivation behind his outreach to Putin? Is he essentially trying to make a deal peace in Ukraine in exchange for economic benefits for the U.S.?
That's certainly one interpretation, and it leads us to this reverse Nixon theory.
Okay.
The idea is that just as Nixon went to China in the 1970s to counter the Soviet Union, Trump might be trying to pull Russia away from China to gain an advantage in the current geopolitical landscape.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah,
But the world has changed a lot since the 1970s.
it has.
Can we really compare the strained Sino-Soviet relations of that era to the seemingly solid partnership between Russia and China today?
That's a crucial point, and it's where the skepticism kicks in. We're not in the Cold War anymore.
Right.
Russia and China are cooperating on an unprecedented level, economically, diplomatically, even militarily.
Wow.
They share a common interest in challenging the U.S.-led world order, and their partnership is a key pillar of that strategy.
It's also worth noting that Trump's approach to China has been anything but consistent. We've seen trade wars, threats of sanctions, and then talk of a new trade deal. It's hard to discern a clear, long-term strategy from his actions.
Exactly, and this inconsistency makes it even harder to believe that Putin would see Trump's overtures as anything more than a tactical maneuver. The article suggests that Putin, shaped by decades of mistrust towards the U.S., views Trump's actions with a great deal of skepticism. He's unlikely to be swayed by friendly words alone, especially when his partnership with China is offering tangible benefits.
So if the reverse Nixon theory is shaky at best, what's the reality of the situation on the ground? Let's talk about the deepening ties between Russia and China, especially since the Ukraine war began. The Al Jazeera article paints a pretty clear picture of this growing interdependence.
Absolutely. Since the war began and the West imposed those heavy sanctions on Russia, China has stepped in to fill the void. It's become a major consumer of Russian energy, providing Moscow with a much-needed source of revenue. Chinese companies are also replacing Western businesses that have left Russia, and bilateral trade between the two countries has skyrocketed.
And then there's the no limits partnership declared by Putin and Xi Jinping.
Right.
That statement made just before the invasion of Ukraine really underscored the depth of their alignment and China's willingness to stand by Russia, even in the face of international condemnation.
That declaration was a significant moment, and it sent a clear signal to the world. It's not just an economic partnership, it's a strategic alliance aimed at reshaping the global order.
Which brings us to a crucial question. Could Trump's actions, even if unintentional, actually end up benefiting China?
That's the great irony of this situation. By attempting to drive a wedge between Russia and China, Trump might actually be strengthening their bond and pushing them closer together.
It's definitely a possibility worth considering. How might China be perceiving the U.S.'s commitment to its allies, especially in the light of the Ukraine conflict and what many see as Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy?
Well, the Al Jazeera article points out that China might see this as a sign of weakness or unreliability on the part of the U.S. if the U.S. is willing to shift its stance on Russia so quickly. What does that say about its commitment to other allies, particularly those in Asia who are facing pressure from China?
I see what you mean. It could make countries like Japan, South Korea, or even India hesitant to fully rely on U.S. security guarantees.
Exactly. And that's precisely what China might be hoping for.
All right, this is getting really interesting. So we've got this reverse Nixon theory, which seems pretty unlikely to succeed. And we've got the reality of a strengthening Russia-China partnership that might actually be bolstered by Trump's actions.
Yeah. It's a complex situation with a lot of moving parts. And the outcome is far from certain. But one thing is clear. The U.S.-Russia-China triangle is the defining geopolitical dynamic of our time, and understanding its complexities is crucial for anyone who wants to make sense of the world today.
Absolutely. And for all you UPSC aspirants out there, this is a textbook example of how international relations can be unpredictable and how seemingly isolated events can have ripple effects across the globe.
It's a fascinating case study, really, and if you dig deeper into history, you'll find that attempts to reset relations with Russia are nothing new, even going back to the Bush era.
Oh, yeah.
There are efforts to build bridges with Putin.
You're talking about that whole building a relationship of mutual respect approach. I remember those images of Bush and Putin hanging out at his ranch in Texas, driving around in pickup trucks.
Yeah.
It all seemed very buddy-buddy.
Exactly. There was this sense of optimism, a belief that personal diplomacy could overcome years of Cold War animosity.
Right.
They spoke about shared interests in combating terrorism and promoting economic cooperation. For a while, it seemed like a genuine reset was possible.
But then reality set in: the Iraq War, the conflict in Georgia, NATO expansion. All of these issues created friction and undermined the fragile trust that had been built.
And then came the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which was a real turning point. Relations plummeted under the Obama administration, and with Biden labeling Putin a murderous dictator, they hit a new low.
It's interesting, though, even during Trump's first term, despite his praise for Putin, the relationship didn't really improve.
Right.
He even imposed new sanctions on Russia.
That's a good point. It highlights the fact that Putin's view of the U.S. is deeply entrenched. It's shaped by decades of perceived betrayals, broken promises, and what he sees as Western encroachment on Russia's sphere of influence. A few friendly words from Trump weren't going to erase all of that.
Especially when you contrast that with the no-limits partnership he has with China.
Yeah.
It's a partnership that offers him economic and diplomatic support, a shared vision of a multipolar world, and perhaps most importantly, a counterweight to U.S. power.
Precisely, China is actively positioning itself as an alternative to the U.S.-led order, and Russia sees this as an opportunity to advance its own interests. This shared goal of undermining U.S. hegemony is a powerful driver of their cooperation.
And the economic ties are becoming increasingly intertwined as well. China is buying up Russian energy, filling the void left by Western companies, and providing Russia with access to its massive market.
It's a mutually beneficial relationship. China needs energy security to fuel its economic growth, and Russia needs a market for its exports and a partner to help it weather the sanctions. This economic interdependence makes the partnership even more durable.
So circling back to this reverse Nixon idea, it seems like any attempt to peel Russia away from China is doomed to fail.
It's highly unlikely, to say the least. Putin is not naive.
Right.
He understands that U.S. foreign policy is often driven by short-term interests and can change drastically from one administration to the next. He's not going to risk jeopardizing his strategic partnership with China for a few vague promises from Trump.
Which leads us back to the question of how China might actually benefit from this whole situation. Could Trump's actions, even if they're not part of a coherent strategy, end up playing right into China's hands?
It's certainly possible. Think about it from China's perspective.
Okay.
Trump's attempts to woo Putin, while likely insincere, reinforce the narrative that the U.S. is an unreliable partner.
Ah, I see what you mean. It creates this perception that the U.S. can't be trusted to maintain its commitments, which could have major implications for its alliances in Asia.
Exactly. Countries like Japan and South Korea might start questioning the credibility of U.S. security guarantees and begin hedging their bets. They might be more willing to engage with China diplomatically and economically, knowing that the U.S. might not always have their backs.
And on top of that, Trump's aggressive trade policies towards Europe are pushing those countries closer to China as well.
Absolutely. Remember, China has been strategically positioning itself as a champion of globalization and free trade, in direct contrast to Trump's America First approach.
So while Trump is focused on containing China, his actions might actually be driving key U.S. allies right into Beijing's arms. Talk about unintended consequences.
It's a classic example of how actions in international relations can backfire. The interconnectedness of the global system means that even seemingly isolated events can have far-reaching ripple effects.
And in this case, the reverse Nixon gambit could end up inadvertently accelerating China's rise and weakening the U.S.'s position on the world stage.
It's definitely a scenario worth considering, and for those of you preparing for the UPSC, this entire situation is a perfect case study of how complex and multifaceted international relations can be. It's a reminder that we can't simply apply Cold War logic to the contemporary world. The dynamics are different, the players are different, and the stakes are higher than ever.
So where does all this leave us? We've unpacked this idea of a reverse Nixon strategy, explored the history of U.S.-Russia relations, and analyzed the growing strength of the Russia-China partnership. It's a lot to digest, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC.
It is a complex landscape, but what's important for aspiring diplomats and policymakers is to be able to see these interconnected trends. The key takeaway here is that international relations aren't a zero-sum game.
Right.
Actions have ripple effects, and what might seem like a clever move in one area can create unexpected consequences elsewhere.
Right, like trying to pull Russia away from China could end up pushing Europe closer to Beijing. It's almost paradoxical.
Exactly, and it highlights the need for a more nuanced and long-term approach to foreign policy, one that considers the interconnectedness of global politics and the potential second-order effects of every action.
This Al Jazeera article really got me thinking about the bigger picture. If the U.S. continues down this path, could we see a world where China becomes the dominant power, not just economically, but also geopolitically?
That's a question a lot of analysts are grappling with. China's rise has been remarkable, and its ambitions are clear. It wants to reshape the global order in a way that reflects its own values and interests. Whether the U.S. can effectively counter that ambition remains to be seen.
Yeah, it makes you realize that we're living through a truly historic period. The decisions made today by leaders like Trump, Putin, and Xi will have profound implications for the future of the world.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important for all of us, not just UPSC aspirants, to stay informed, engage in these critical discussions, and think deeply about the challenges facing our world.
Well said. So for all you future diplomats and policymakers out there, remember that the world is a complex and dynamic system. There are no easy answers in international relations. The best we can do is stay informed, analyze the situation carefully, and be prepared to adapt to the constantly changing geopolitical landscape.
And never underestimate the power of history. Understanding past successes and failures can provide valuable insights into how to navigate the challenges of the present and the future.
Couldn't agree more now. Before we wrap up, I want to remind everyone to check out the full Al Jazeera article we discussed today. It's full of insightful analysis that will definitely help you in your UPSC preparation. You can find the link in the show notes.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you from this discussion? What questions do you still have about the reverse Nixon theory or the future of U.S.-Russia-China relations? Leave a comment below and let's continue the conversation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Everyone, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our future episodes. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and good luck with your UPSC journey.